Should some of us be stopped from having children?
Eugenics is the controversial belief that we can improve the human race by selecting who can and who can't reproduce.
It would have been better by far for them and for the rest of the community if they had never been born.
Eugenics was notoriously used to justify the Holocaust, but we've seen that it was first developed and promoted by British scientists and politicians.
My goodness.
British idea. We invented it.
It led to disabled, poor and non-white people being locked up and sterilised.
The greatest horrors of the 20th century, the ideological roots are partly right here in London, near where I live.
I'm Angela Saini, an author and science journalist. Now I want to investigate how eugenics rebranded itself after the horrors of the Second World War and how its devastating legacy continued across the world.
We have 8 million sterilisations happening in India within 1 year.
That's shocking. 8 million.
We'll see how eugenic-style attitudes towards the poor remain with us in today's Britain.
That is quite explicitly a message to some parts of society: we think you're having too many children.
I'm Adam Pearson, a reporter and disability rights activist. I was born with a genetic condition. I want to explore, do medical breakthroughs, combined with prejudice against disabled people, mean we're on the verge of a new era of eugenics?
I think we need to kill these people, right? At the very least, imprison them.
Could we be heading for a society where anyone not considered perfect will be prevented from being born?
If you're telling me that a world without me is a better world, what does that say about me?
That's eugenics, isn't it?
Exactly.
Philosophically, it's a minefield. A complete minefield.
In the aftermath of World War II, the horrors of the Holocaust became widely known. But few connected these events with the work of British scientists. Eugenics, one of the ideologies driving the Nazis' genocidal project, originated in Victorian London. It had become part of mainstream British thought and even helped shape government policy. This was now an inconvenient truth, and most British advocates of eugenics distanced themselves from it. But some did not. This is King's College London, where I studied as a postgraduate. I've asked to see the collected papers of Reginald Ruggles Gates, Professor of Botany here. He continued to espouse openly eugenic views throughout the 1950s.
My goodness. So this is a skin colour chart, and it shows at the beginning, it says, represents a skin colour of an individual coloured person, so this is presumably someone who isn't racially mixed, and the skin colour of a white person who isn't racially mixed, and then lots of colours in between. And the purpose of this is to look at racial mixing so that he can identify who is more mixed and who isn't. He was obsessed by skin colour. Clearly, I mean, he's drawn up a chart, for goodness sake, and here it comes in a wheel as well.
Gates believed that racial intermarriage would cause mental and physical disabilities, would dilute and degrade the more advanced race, was how he put it.
Gates believed that races were different species, so not just that we have superficial differences like skin colour, but that we evolved separately. And so for him, there was a real danger here in races mixing.
In the early 1960s, Gates helped found a notorious journal called Mankind Quarterly, which argued for eugenics. It was influential with supporters of racial segregation in America and apartheid in South Africa. Even today, it's present in the toxic ideologies of the far right. Gates's interest in race spanned so far that in his papers, I even stumbled on something personal to me.
I was looking through the catalogue. One mentioned Saini's, which is my surname, so I've got this here. The study of ABO blood groups of Saini's of Punjab. The subjects of various districts were studied in Punjab, Hoshiarpur, Jalandhar, and Ambala. Hoshiarpur is where my father's family are from. So these were blood tests taken from people who could, well, very easily have been members of my family at the time. And that's so strange.
It's unnerving. Although this paper wasn't written by Gates, he collected it as part of a scientific quest to promote racial difference.
We need to read this. We need to understand the history of this, because if we don't, then it just gets swept under the carpet. So even though it's painful to read it, and personally painful, especially for me, it's incredibly important, I think, that we see it. And I'm glad this archive is here.
Investigating eugenics, I knew I'd uncover stories of people whose lives had been deeply damaged. But I didn't realise how disturbing it would be to meet them in person. Elena is a member of the Roma community who live in the Czech Republic.
A když propěchl to plodovou vodu, tak mi vyletěla pupeční šňůra. Měla jsem velké bolesti, ke mně přišla sestřička s 2 papíry.
In 1990, in hospital for the birth of her second child, Elena had no idea what was about to happen to her.
V těch velkých bolestech jsem vzala ten papír, podepsala jsem to a absolutně nevím, co tam bylo. Poté jsem zase usla a vlastně potom na druhý den mě dali na normální pokoj, kde přišel pán primář a řekl mi, já jsem se ptala, co se stalo, a on mi řekl, že mi udělali sterilizaci. Tak já jsem začala brečet a ptala jsem se, co to znamená. On mi řekl, že už nebudu mít nikdy děti. Bylo mi teprve 21 let. A taky jsem se ptala ohledně nějakých finanční odměny. Nikdo se mnou o tom nechtěl mluvit a vyhodili mě ven.
She was told later that as her previous 2 children had been born via caesarean section, she was sterilised to prevent further risky pregnancies. But she was never consulted and soon found out that other Romani women had had similar experiences.
A ženy vyprávěly své příběhy a byly i docela smutné, protože sdělovali ve svém životě, například opustil manžel.
Why do you think you were sterilised?
Tak nabízeli to proto, aby se nerodily romské děti. Oni nechtěli z vrchu, jakoby vláda, asi pravděpodobně to bylo řízené, aby to ty sestřičky nabízely těm ženám, protože nechtěli, aby se rodily romské děti.
Why Romani women in particular?
Tak nechtěli, aby bylo jako majorita určitě nechtěla, aby byla větší populace Romů.
Elena is now the head of a group of Romani women who all claim they were sterilised and have campaigned for years for justice. Recently, a Czech MP introduced a bill to the country's parliament to compensate them for what happened to them. A little bit messed up, isn't it, that a woman who was already from a marginalised community just sterilised? It angers me that this was happening in the 90s. And I can't get my head around that timeline at all. I've been saying for a while now, this could have been me. But in reality, it could have been anyone. Anyone could have been handed a document to sign in a blind panic and then been sterilised.
It's a little-known fact that sterilisation policies carried on in many countries after the war. In Sweden, more than 60,000 people were sterilised to improve racial purity in a state programme which carried on until the mid-1970s. 2 Canadian provinces and 33 American states practiced sterilisation before and after the war. North Carolina alone sterilised more than 7,000 people. Historian Marius Turda has investigated how sterilisation programs were the result of years of lobbying by American and European eugenicists. He begins by telling me about Carlos Blacker, the General Secretary of the British Eugenics Society from 1931 to 1952.
It's a very important eugenicist, both before and after 1945.
Blacker joined forces with people like Margaret Sanger, the American birth control activist and eugenicist. They campaigned against overpopulation in places like India.
By 1952, they all convened in Bombay, India, to actually convince the Indian governments that the only way to deal with poverty is to diminish the fertility rates. We need to bring some form of eugenic therapy, inverted commas, to countries such as India. And the Indian government is finally persuaded.
The Indian government offered cash to its citizens to get sterilised.
I mean, these are enormous figures. So just in this one place in Madras, between 1956 and 1962, more than 55,000 people were sterilised.
In the 1960s and 70s, as India suffered natural disasters and famine, the American government and aid agencies made it clear to the Indian authorities that if they wanted aid, they would have to control the population. Lyndon Johnson told one of his advisors, "I'm not going to piss away foreign aid in nations where they refuse to deal with their own population problems." The message got through. In the mid-1970s, Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi suspended democratic rule, and her son, Sanjay Gandhi, led an extraordinary campaign to reduce the country's birth rate.
And by 1976, 1977, we have 8 million sterilisation happening in India within 1 year.
It's shocking. 8 million. I can't...
Yes, it is quite a number.
It's shocking to me that I don't know that.
You can imagine how many... Yes.
The Indian government didn't call this policy eugenics. It was framed as an answer to famine. But human rights critics argue that the burden of sterilisation fell heavily on India's poor, echoing the history of eugenics.
We have stories about bulldozers going into very poor neighbourhoods and, fishing out the men and sterilising them. And
I mean,
there's no speculation that up to this point, maybe we're talking about 40 million people sterilised in India. So since 1950s to these days.
It's important not to damn the whole population control movement. They weren't all eugenicists. Many were driven by sincere environmental concerns or to improve women's access to birth control.
Not all of these people are eugenicists. There are a lot of people interested in population issues who are not eugenicists. However, it was the big figures in this movement, at least in the 1950s, had that eugenic inclination.
Well, I think one thing that is recurrent in the story of eugenics throughout the 20th century is that the target always seems to be the poorest, whether that's the poorest within British society or whether that's the poor wherever they happen to be in the world. Just goes to show that that element of wanting to get rid of poor people, one way or another, remains, and in some ways is the darkest element of eugenics, that, only the wealthy should be allowed to have children. That has never changed. That's been the constant throughout.
The other side of the British eugenic vision was to encourage the educated middle classes to have more children, something eugenicists pushed even after the war. I'm meeting a retired academic with a strange story. In the early 1960s, Hilary Rose and her husband were working at the London School of Economics. To Hilary's surprise, the LSE quietly offered an incentive to academics to have more babies. Why? Because they were seen as the brightest and the best.
And it was funny. What we got was £50 for every child that you had.
And how was this presented to you then?
Well, it just was there in your pay slip. I mean, nobody told you about it. You thought, where did this money come from?
So for all the extra children you had, you were given £50?
We just had 2 children.
Right,
so
okay.
We got £200. If we only had one academic, obviously a male academic, then they would have only got £100.
Remarkably, the scheme had originally been proposed in the 1920s by then LSE director William Beveridge, the future architect of the welfare state. He had been fascinated by the idea of positive eugenics.
When you look back on that now in the 21st century, how do you feel about it?
Well, a bit guilty. I mean, it's, it was so unjust.
But did you feel at all flattered that you were considered the desirable parents, that you were the good people?
No, I mean, we just laughed about it. I mean, look, I'm married to a biologist. I mean, he knows the whole thing. It's just scientific garbage. I regard it as just monstrous. If you believe that all children should be treated with love and care and have a good life. I mean, how could I feel that's an incentive?
Hilary went on to have a distinguished career as a sociologist. She's spoken out against the promotion of eugenics under the guise of population control or social improvement.
What do you do if you've got a litter of dogs and one is the runt of the litter? You strangle it or you put it in a bucket of water. And that's how I think the ruling strata thought about the people, is that you want to look after it, you want to look after the national stock.
I couldn't have imagined that eugenics would continue in Britain after the war. But now I'm wondering if its key dogma, that the poor are some kind of burden, has survived. The phrase problem families was used by the Eugenics Society in the 1950s to describe an underclass in which crime, poverty, and unemployability run through generations. More recent politicians don't talk about this as a genetic problem, but they have talked in terms of culture and society. In 1974, senior Conservative politician Keith Joseph said the human stock was threatened by poor people breeding too much. In 2006, Tony Blair said problem families were a menace to society. And in 2011, after riots in British cities, David Cameron laid some of the blame on troubled families.
I think we've all known for years that a relatively small number of families are the source of a large proportion of problems in our society. Drug addiction, alcohol abuse, crime, a culture of disruption and irresponsibility that cascades through generations.
But in recent years, a series of reports and inquiries have debunked the notion that unemployment and crime run in families. Professor Jonathan Portis was one of a number of experts asked by the government to carry out an independent evaluation of its Troubled Families programme.
The myth of intergenerational worklessness has been comprehensively exploded. There are very, very, very few families that are workless for more than one generation, let alone for 2 or 3 generations. There's always been a view that there were the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. And the way it's sold or justified is typically with the, a spread in a tabloid newspaper of a mum with 10 or 11 children, and the message is these people are special. They're somehow breeding like rabbits, and you, the honest, hard-working taxpayer, are paying for them.
I'm sure there's no politicians, there are no policymakers now who would ever think in these terms, who would ever advocate, as they did in the 1920s and 1930s, sterilisation for certain groups of people, or, to encourage certain people to reproduce and not others.
Well, that's not quite true, of course.
Really?
Well, I mean, we have just chosen to introduce a 3-child limit in universal credit. More than 2 children, that is your lot. You are being irresponsible, and you, your family, your children will have to accept the financial consequences of that irresponsibility.
With some exceptions, families whose 3rd child is born after the 6th of April 2017 don't receive universal credit for that child or any more.
We are effectively saying to low-income families, and that includes low-income families in work, that we are going to penalise you for the act of having a 3rd child. And I think that is quite explicitly a message to some parts of society. Actually, we think you're having too many children.
The idea that some groups are a burden to society is still with us. And in recent years, social media has become rife with prejudice. Here, the eugenic idea that some people aren't fit to breed is back with a vengeance. I've come to Staley Bridge, just outside of Manchester. The reason being, I've come to talk to a friend of mine, Steve. He's done a bit of TV work, advocacy work, etc. He's got a genetic condition, and there's a 50-50 chance he could pass it on to his children. And most crucial to this story, has expressed interest in both him and his wife starting a family. Steve has the genetic condition Cruzon syndrome, which means some of the bones in his skull fuse together too early in infancy. There are potentially dangerous side effects, but with modern medical care, people with the syndrome have a normal life expectancy. But after Steve and his wife Vicky told a newspaper they were thinking of starting a family, they began to receive online hate messages.
I think we need to kill these people, right? At the very least, imprison them. If you heard there was someone out there intentionally infecting people with the debilitating diseases, would you let them run around and continue to do so, or try to put a stop to it? How does society feel about forced vasectomies? Some courts are just better cut. It's either that or we beat this guy over the head with a rock and ship him down the river to the 80s cult classic that he came from. And that kind of shocked us more than anything, because it's not something I've usually come across. I've come across the bullying comments, people making childish names and abusing me, but that's a whole new level that I've experienced.
I was upset. Obviously, hearing them say things like that about my husband, who I love dearly, obviously is a massive shock.
I'm fully prepared for if I do have a child with Cruzon's. I've been brought up with the situation that you have a condition, you're not different from anyone else, and that's the kind of environment I can bring my child up in.
And you can still live a happy life.
So you guys have really thought this through. I mean, no one knows the path of Cruzon's better than you.
We both agree that we make fantastic parents. I think if we did have a baby or children, they'd all be greatly loved.
I'm really angry right now. I want to know when did we as a human race decide when it was okay to say who can and who can't have kids. And it's made all the more infuriating by the fact that these are people I know. This is like a really good mate of mine and his wife who wanting to start a family, which is like a perfectly normal thing, are just subject to such scrutiny and vitriol. And to make matters worse, there are also growing fears around recent medical breakthroughs. About 1 in 5 people in the UK have a form of disability, and some of them worry that emerging science might usher in a new era of eugenics. Sarah Lytle was born with albinism and is almost completely blind. She's also a genetic researcher and is concerned about the potential misuse of medical advances. What is the medical landscape like at the moment?
What's been developing a lot over the past few years has been screening. So I think the most prominent example people will know about is Down syndrome screening in pregnancy.
Today, an estimated 90% of Down syndrome pregnancies are terminated. Advocacy groups like the Don't Screen Us Out campaign are concerned that one day people with Down syndrome will be eradicated from society. And now a new technique is available that could expand screening hugely.
Now we can do non-invasive antenatal genetics, which basically where you take a blood sample from the mum and you're basically, because there's a very small amount of DNA from the baby is going to be circulating in mum's blood. So actually by taking a sample of blood from mum, we can now look at, are there certain genetic changes in the baby? And at the moment, this is mostly being done in a targeted approach. So like a family might have one child with cystic fibrosis, which is, a life-limiting condition. They might say, we don't want a second child with cystic fibrosis. So at the moment, I think it's still very much based on if you know your family has a condition. But who knows whether in future this would just become a much more broad approach, where you say, actually, we screen for every potential genetic mutation there is, and then we actually, I don't know how many embryos would be left in the end. We'd actually have to rule out probably about a tenth of all pregnancies.
Could this mean that in the future there'll be fewer people like me and these children? We share the same genetic condition, neurofibromatosis type 1, or NF1. It's caused by a mutation on a single gene. This causes benign tumours to appear. Mine are on my face, but they can form anywhere, causing many different complications. You eat pizza as well? Screening can now detect NF1 in embryos, and couples can choose not to go ahead with pregnancies. I asked the mum of 8-year-old Ellie what she thinks.
This is, I think, really, really tough. Yeah. When you're thinking about it from a eugenics point of view, you're thinking about what genetic issues do you not want to carry on populating, but you're missing out on what potentially could you have. That's aside from that. And I think to view a person's life as a catalogue of medical appointments really misses out on all the other stuff that matters far more.
Some disabled people fear screening will ultimately remove them from society, which is what eugenicists have always wanted. I'm with the Litchi family. Mum, Dad, and both children are all deaf. We're getting to the stage now medically where we can start screening for things like deafness. Is that a good idea?
No. I was really angry when I first heard that they were able to look at the genes of a baby or an embryo and then get rid of the deaf genes. And I thought, do you think that deaf people's lives aren't worth living? Does that mean deaf people are lesser than hearing people? And I felt very offended by that. I believe deaf people have a lot of life to live and a lot to offer and provide to society. I feel targeted because all that campaigning for human rights, for rights about, for example, black, white people, gay, straight people, it just feels like all that campaigning for all of this equality law actually doesn't mean anything because disabled people are being targeted by this. Yeah, I feel like two stories, you know? At one hand, we're valued and we should have equality, and on the other hand, we shouldn't have existed in the first place.
But is screening always wrong? Philosophically, it's a minefield. Complete minefield. The worlds of Adam Pearson and NF1 are completely and utterly inseparable. You know, I've dealt with it, and I've got no doubt my prospective children will be able to deal with it. Would it be easier if they didn't have to? Kind of, for me, I wouldn't change it for the world, because it's made me who I am, and it's given me the platform that I now have. But you know, I've had, 35 surgeries by 34 years of age. That's not fun. Got bullied a lot at school. And there's the whole, when you have a facial disfigurement, you somehow lose your anonymity and become public property. And it's also not my decision exclusively, either. You know, whenever we're talking about kind of raising children, there's invariably always someone else involved. I want to meet people who use screening to avoid passing on a hereditary condition. All good, nice to meet you. I'm meeting the Kiyotchi family. Dad Michael, like me, has NF1. So, much like me, you have NF1, but it's affected us in very different ways, obviously. I've got a lot of fibroma on my face and upper body. How has it affected you?
So I've got quite a few like fibromas as well. Yeah, so I've got the fibroma here. I've got a few. I've got them like all down my back. I just look like I've got a lot of extra nipples all over my body, generally on my back. But I think apart from that, I'm still quite clumsy. And I think Emma will probably tell you that sometimes my short-term memory's not brilliant. I can get quite forgetful at times.
Yeah, very.
I'm clumsy as hell. So we have that in common. Their first son, Josh, was conceived naturally. He has inherited the NF1 gene.
So he's 13 years old now.
And how has NF affected Josh?
He's got moderate learning problems. He's got a plexiform neurofibroma under his tongue. He's got them round his jaws. He's hypermobility. He's got scoliosis. Very outgoing. He doesn't let anything stand in his way. But I think he's starting to realise now, doesn't he, that he's a little bit different.
After Josh was born, Emma and Michael heard about a pioneering new medical technique called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which involves creating embryos using IVS. On average, in cases like the Kiyotchis, half will carry the NF gene and half won't. Doctors select the embryos without the faulty gene and implant them in the mother's womb.
I think with us, they reimplanted 2, and then that's how we ended up with Oliver.
Nice.
Yeah.
And there's the debate that rages on is, are we ultimately screening out disability? How was the response in the NF community?
Well, we did have a few people that said that they didn't agree with what we were doing, which I did struggle with for a while, but I have no regrets.
But do you understand the point they're making? That
yeah, I do.
Are we or aren't we screening out disability?
I do understand that, but why should a child suffer unnecessarily if they don't have to?
And so we're not trying to get rid of like people who are alive today. You know, we're just trying to give people, to children who haven't even been born yet, the best chance for the future, which is a completely different thing altogether.
No, completely.
I mean, I do wonder sometimes if I've given Michael and Joshua the idea that maybe I was saying that they weren't good enough, but I was just doing it to have a healthy child. Yeah. I didn't want another child to go through what Joshua's been through, so...
Yeah, I think like most parents, all you ever want is what's best for your children, really.
I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I think it's what is best for you. I don't think what we've done is wrong.
Everyone makes their own decisions.
Yeah, I think everyone's circumstances are different. Everyone's had different experiences.
So currently, this technology is being used to screen for things like NF and Huntington's. But the big debate is that the further advanced it becomes, the more possibilities there are. And it could stray off into a kind of design your own baby area. Where do you think the line should be drawn?
I think we've got it right in the UK at the moment. I mean, when you go for your PGD, there's not like a shopping list of, do you want a boy or a girl, what colour eyes and hair do you want them to have? It is solely basically to make sure that the baby's healthy, doesn't have the same problem that you have yourself.
It seems perfectly reasonable to me that a family where two members already have a genetic condition like NF1 would try PGD. I really like them, and they've really thought it through. They just ultimately, as parents, want the best possible life for their kids, which is what any parent wants and isn't unreasonable. And I get it. I would probably make a very similar choice in their situation. And I understand the objection that if we start screening out disability, what does that say about how we value disabled people? I don't think that's what's happening with PGD. I think there's a definite line that's been drawn in the sand. Where this all starts to become a bit more eugenic in its practice is when you go from trying to relieve suffering and slowly creep towards enhancing and altering humans.
Oliver is a living, breathing example of how modern genetic science can alleviate suffering. But what if the same kind of technology that helped him could be used to change children in other ways? What if you could use IVF to create a number of embryos and genetically test them for skills or talents? So, for instance, you could choose the one likely to be the most intelligent. Current law prohibits this use for PGD, but some scientists say it could be technically possible and that we need to consider it. When you look at the history of eugenics, intelligence is key. How do we figure out who are the most intelligent people and who are the least intelligent? But identifying intelligence is so difficult. Even now, we have IQ testing, but many scientists are not confident that IQ tests really measure intelligence, even if we know what intelligence is in all its complexity. It's such a kind of difficult thing to pin down. But there are some geneticists out there who believe that we can not only measure intelligence through tests, so through written down tests, but that if we look inside our DNA, inside our genomes, we might be able to isolate intelligence in our genes. And it's incredibly controversial. I don't know if the science is even there yet. I don't think the science is there. But I certainly want to understand how it works and how they think it might be possible. I'm visiting scientists at King's College London. They've called publicly for society and government to urgently confront the possibility that we will, in the future, be able to screen embryos for intelligence. Here and around the world, scientists have spent years looking at educational achievement and trying to find shared patterns in DNA. So if I were to have my DNA sampled and then send it into a company, it would end up somewhere like this?
Yes.
They say that occasional variations in a person's genome, known as their genetic score, can partly explain how well that person could do at school and university. And in theory, you could do that test before they're even born.
So we now have lots of information from huge samples of people. So these are called genome-wide association studies. The most recent study that looked at this found that knowing someone's genetic score, right now, on the information we have right now on their genetic score, we could do that, or an adult, just take a DNA test, saliva or blood or whatever. It's about as good as knowing, in terms of predicting how well they'll do in school, it's about as good as knowing their parents' income. So, not that good, but so obviously people differ a lot within income brackets of how well they do at school. Some people do really well, some people don't. With this genetic score, some people do really well and some people don't, but it's about as good as knowing their parents' income.
This is hotly debated. Just because two things are associated, it doesn't mean one is necessarily causing the other. These genetic markers may not be directly linked to intelligence, but may, for example, be more common in better-off families who took part in the study, who can afford a higher standard of education. Whatever the true relationship, Stewart and his colleagues argue that they can use DNA to partly predict educational achievement.
Can you imagine a day when a mother or a father will be able to go to a clinic, have their fetuses tested, and pick out the one that they think of as the ideal child?
Yeah. In the future, yeah, I totally think that the technology is possible to do that, which is why we need to be having this debate now. At the moment, we've made the decision as a society that we test for rare diseases because we don't want kids growing up with those, devastating rare conditions. But we need to adjust that debate and start talking now about other traits as well, and which we should be allowing parents to select for. This information is going to be available, and we need to work out what we're going to do with it. We're now at the point where we can make predictions. We can say this person's predicted to be, in the top end of the educational distribution, for instance, or this person is predicted to do really, really poorly on an intelligence test.
So really, just by studying their DNA, you can make that prediction?
Yeah.
So when we look at the history of eugenics, I mean, the entire impetus behind it was the idea that we could isolate in somebody's body with their innate capacities, their innate abilities, and from that be able to tell, whether they would be useful to society or not so useful to society. Do you feel that genetics now is getting towards that?
No, because science doesn't tell us anything about whether people have any kind of innate worth or value or anything like that. That's completely outside of the realm of science. We have to make judgments about that. My personal view is that everyone has equal worth no matter what their intelligence test score. They're just differences, that's all they are. And we have to work out ways of dealing with that.
I mean, on the surface of it, you could say, if you could screen out a very damaging condition, something that might shorten your child's life or cause them severe disabilities in the future, then why would you not want to be able to do that? So to go one step further and say, well, now that we can screen out for these diseases, perhaps we can screen out for more everyday diseases, and perhaps after that we could screen for the genes that might make you have a certain eye colour or a certain hair colour or a certain level of intelligence. And why then wouldn't you want to do that as well? If you're going one step, why not go all the way? Logically, then it's hard to fault that because we've already started walking down that path. But it's incredibly fraught, and I think it's as fraught now as it was 100 years ago. We haven't really resolved these ethical queries for ourselves.
I've learned so far that today's genetic technologies are only used to ease suffering. But as science advances, it puts current regulations under more and more strain. And of course, regulations can be broken. This is the Francis Crick Institute in London. I'm here to quiz Britain's top geneticist about a scientific scandal that shocked the world. It concerns a revolutionary new technique known as gene editing, and it's raised the spectre of unborn children being genetically enhanced, a eugenic dream. And it was all to do with this man. In November 2018, Chinese scientist He Jiankui, or JK as he refers to himself, stunned the world when he made an announcement at a genetics conference in Hong Kong.
First of all, that we didn't know when he accepted the invitation to come and speak to us any of the work that he's now going to talk about. It was
leading British geneticist Robin Lovell-Badge was one of the conference organisers.
His hero is Bob Edwards, the pioneer of in vitro fertilisation. He told me that he wanted to emulate this. He wanted to do something that would be of benefit to millions of people.
For the last 3 years, JK had been performing gene editing experiments in secret on humans.
He was driven by huge ambition, and he was very wealthy.
JK recruited 7 couples where the man was HIV positive. He told them he could use gene editing to make their children immune to the disease. Gene editing works thanks to something called CRISPR-Cas9, a programmable molecular scissor. This can be programmed to find a specific location on the DNA molecule and cut it. Then a new piece of genetic code can be inserted there. JK tried to use this technique to give embryos something called a CCR5 delta 32 mutation. People born with this can be resistant to HIV. In late 2018, twin girls were born who had undergone JK's gene editing. But it seems although he had made some change to the baby's genes, it wasn't the ones he'd intended.
He didn't actually make the delta 32 mutation, which we understand something about. He made completely random mutations, but we don't know the consequences of the specific mutations he's made in the gene.
Hi, I'm Anna Middleton and I'm head of society.
The conference attendees were shocked.
Cambridge.
We were just stunned because basically what he had done was completely outside all ethical frameworks that we all stand by, is illegal in many countries, and he was completely unregulated. And we've learned since that the ethics process that he claimed to have gone through wasn't real, it was fake, and the consent process that the families apparently engaged with was also not real and true. So it was fraudulent.
After the huge international outcry against his work, JK is reported to be under house arrest in China. So, where does all this leave us with the hype over designer babies? At present, scientists have had some limited success editing genes in mice. How successful?
Well, that's the problem. At the moment, it's not efficient enough. So when we're doing experiments in mice, occasionally it works really well. We get maybe 90%, 95%, sometimes 100% of the mice born carrying the particular genetic alteration we wanted. But often it's not that efficient. It's down to about 20% or so. So that's not good enough. If we really want to use these techniques, we have to know that they're going to work preferably in all the embryos, and certainly in all the cells within each embryo.
These techniques will improve, but will they ever be used to make a baby stronger or cleverer? Traits like these are the result of your upbringing, environment, and hundreds of genes working in tandem. So the idea that designer babies are just around the corner is pure science fiction.
You know, it's hard enough altering one gene and making sure that there are no problems, that you've done exactly the alteration you want. If you start saying, I want to alter 5 genes, all the complications multiply each time, so you increase the number. It's possible, but it gets harder and harder. And if you're talking about 20, 50, 100 genes, forget it. It's just not possible.
So there's a big difference between me and the missus coming to you and saying, hey, we want to correct for the NF gene, yes. And then coming to you and saying, hey, don't make it ginger, quite smart, not too smart, and don't have it like Chelsea. That's a whole different...
Completely impossible to do the latter. We would hope to be able to do the former, but we could not possibly do the latter.
Gene editing has enormous potential. One day, it will help cure cancers and other diseases. And of course, it's impractical to monitor every scientist in every corner of the world, so abuses are still possible. But I wanted to know how we in the UK are preparing for future scientific breakthroughs. So I've come to meet one of the country's leading genetic scientists. Ewan Burney, Director of Genomics England, was part of the team that sequenced the human genome.
The first thing to emphasize is there are many questions which don't get answered by scientists here. So there are many questions where science gives us new options and tools and things that we could do, but we have to have a process to decide societally what is acceptable or not. And so we need a forum which isn't science-led, where science informs, but the decision is made by society. Now, in the UK, for many of these decisions, the Human Fertilisation and Embryo Authority is a very good model for this. It's one of the best in the world, where they have some legislative framework that's set up by Parliament, and then they have a set of non-scientists thinking very hard and taking evidence from many different groups to make a decision about what's allowable and what's not allowable.
So you understand that mistrust because of past mistakes?
I think so, and I think a real mistake is to pretend the history isn't there, because some of the leading lights who founded genetics were also strong proponents of eugenics. So it's part of our history that we have to understand and own, and we have to be cognizant that people can make these arguments again, and then we need to understand and be able to rebut them both scientifically, but also engage with people in society to show that we understand what we're doing and how our tools can be used.
Eugenics is a chilling lesson from history. At its heart is the belief that who we can be and what we're capable of is decided on the day we're born. And as a science journalist, what's particularly disturbing for me is to see how this aspect of eugenics has survived. Some people still believe that there are substantial innate differences between classes and races. As political tensions rise around the world, it's crucial that we understand properly where the small differences we see between us actually come from. I've come to Oxford to hear the results of a giant research project to answer precisely this question. It was led by Oxford University and John Radcliffe Hospital.
The Integra 21st project is a population-based study. It's an international study which has been carried out in 8 different countries across the world. Each site had 600 mothers who were pregnant.
The baby's physical growth and neurological development were measured in the womb, at birth, and through their early lives.
What we're doing at the moment is a snapshot at the time of their second birthday. What we would expect normally developing children to look like from a neurodevelopment point of view at the time of their second birthday.
Mothers were chosen who were well-nourished, healthy, living in a good environment and with good medical care. The aim was to see how children develop if they're given an equal start in life. Professor Stephen Kennedy says the results were clear.
When you study healthy women around the world, their babies grow in a similar way inside the womb. They achieve a similar size at birth, and they continue to grow in a similar way up until 2 years of age. They've hit the same similar milestones, irrespective of the color of their skin, irrespective of race, ethnicity, any of these terms, or where they're living.
We found that the differences between countries was less than 10%. And if the environments are decent or good enough, we've showed that the fetuses and the children in all these different countries could achieve that very same potential.
No one is saying that genes do not contribute something to human growth and brain development. No one's saying that. All one is saying is that nurture is far, far more important than nature. Get nurture right, people will thrive, will grow as they should do to their full potential.
What's surprising to me is that Professor Kennedy says his team's work has ruffled feathers.
It's generally believed that there's an association between a mother's skin color and how well children grow inside the womb.
Really? Where is it generally believed that this is the case?
In the scientific community and certainly in the lay community.
That's quite shocking.
They visit rural India and they see that the children are stunted. They don't ask themselves the question, why are these kids stunted? It's got nothing to do with the mother's genetic inheritance. It's got everything to do with the fact that the mother may be malnourished, just as her parents and her grandparents were.
So you think there are still people within the scientific community, then, the mainstream scientific community, who do cling to these ideas that populations are different, that there are some kind of fundamental differences between people of different class or different race?
Absolutely. This is the belief out there.
What your study really shows is that that's not the case. We are pretty much all the same.
We're all the same. We are one species, Homo sapiens. So the public health message is massive. If you wish to improve overall human capital in your country, invest in women.
Eugenics began with scientists claiming that certain groups of people are superior because of what they inherit. Our story ends with the opposite conclusion. As a species, human DNA is unusually similar. What makes us different is much more than our genes.
For more than 100 years, a lot of us have been fed this message that we are who we are. You know, we're born a certain way, and that contains all the potential for that human being, that this baby's fate is decided on the day that they're born. I know the effects of racial stereotypes. I've heard them myself. Living as a person of Indian origin in Britain, I am British, but I'm not always treated as the same as white British people. I think it will take a long time for us to move away from that and have a more nuanced and balanced understanding of what it means to be human.
Making these films, I've heard some amazing stories and met some amazing people. People I won't forget. People who were written off by society. People who were deemed to be lesser. People who proved everyone wrong. If delving into eugenics has taught me anything, it's about humanity. It's about how to root for the underdog. I'm the ultimate underdog. How can I not root for them? And at some point, we're all going to be touched by at least the principles of eugenics. Right? We're all going to get turned down for something, or get knocked back because we're not deemed useful enough or desirable enough in a particular area. And it's a case of, how do we respond to that? How far do we go to attain this false narrative of perfection?